A 22-year-old Virginia militia officer crouches in the rain-soaked wilderness of the Ohio Valley. It's May 28, 1754, and he's about to give an order that will ignite a war spanning 5 continents. His men have surrounded a small French patrol, and at his signal, they open fire. Within 15 minutes, 10 Frenchmen lie dead, including their commander, whose skull is then split open by a Native American ally. The young officer doesn't know it yet, but he has just started a global conflict that will kill over 1 million people, redraw the map of the world, and determine which empires will dominate the next centuries. His name is George Washington, and in this moment, this confused, violent, rain-soaked moment in the Pennsylvania wilderness, he has lit a fuse that will burn across oceans. Winston Churchill, looking back from the 20th century, called what followed the First World War. He wasn't being dramatic. He was being accurate, because the 7 Years' War wasn't fought in one place or between 2 countries. It was fought in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. It involved every major power on Earth. It pitted alliance against alliance in a struggle for global supremacy. And when the smoke cleared, the world was fundamentally different. France was humiliated. Britain was ascendant. Prussia had emerged as a great power. The stage was set for the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the colonial order that would define the next 200 years. This is the story of that war, the real First World War. A story of genius and desperation, of battles in frozen German fields and tropical Indian plains, of sea fights in the Caribbean and massacres in the American frontier. A story that shaped everything that came after. It begins, like so many catastrophes, with a death and a broken promise. To understand how the world stumbled into a global war in the 1750s, you need to understand what Europe looked like at mid-century. The continent was dominated by 5 great powers, each with its own ambitions, its own grievances, and its own carefully maintained alliances. France was the largest and most populous nation in Western Europe. Under Louis XV, it remained the cultural center of the continent, the model other courts imitated, the language other diplomats spoke. But France was also overextended, fighting to maintain influence in Europe while simultaneously building a colonial empire in North America, the Caribbean, and India. Britain was France's perpetual rival. The 2 powers had been fighting on and off for centuries, competing for trade, colonies, and naval supremacy. Britain had a smaller population than France, but a more powerful navy and a more dynamic economy. And Britain had something France lacked, a coherent strategic vision focused on colonial expansion and commercial dominance. Austria, ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, was still reeling from the loss of Silesia to Prussia in the 1740s. Empress Maria Theresa had spent the years since that humiliation rebuilding her army and plotting revenge. She wanted Silesia back. She wanted Frederick of Prussia destroyed. And she was willing to overturn centuries of diplomatic tradition to achieve it. Prussia was the newcomer, the upstart, the kingdom that shouldn't have been able to compete with the established powers. But under Frederick II, Frederick the Great, Prussia had transformed itself into a military machine of terrifying efficiency. Frederick had stolen Silesia from Austria through a combination of speed, aggression, and utter disregard for treaties. Now he sat on his conquest, knowing that Maria Theresa would never forgive him, and Russia, the sleeping giant in the east, was increasingly drawn into European affairs. Empress Elizabeth despised Frederick personally. He had made insulting remarks about her that had reached her ears, and Russia was looking for opportunities to expand its influence westward. These 5 powers had traditionally aligned in predictable ways. Britain and Austria were allies, bound together by shared opposition to France. France and Prussia had cooperated against Austria. Russia's position varied but generally leaned toward Austria. This was the system that had maintained rough equilibrium for decades. And in the mid-1750s, it was about to be completely overturned. The diplomatic revolution of 1756 was one of the most dramatic realignments in European history. It began with colonial tensions. In North America, British and French colonists were clashing over control of the Ohio Valley, that very territory where young George Washington had triggered the initial violence. Both empires claimed the region. Neither was willing to back down. And neither government in London or Paris seemed able to control the situation. By 1755, undeclared warfare had broken out in the colonies. British forces under General Edward Braddock marched toward the French Fort Duquesne, only to be ambushed and slaughtered. The French captured British ships. Both sides escalated, even as diplomats in Europe insisted that peace still technically prevailed. But the colonial conflict was only part of the picture. The deeper issue was the transformation of the European alliance system. Austria's Chancellor, Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, had spent years working toward a single goal: isolating Prussia and recovering Silesia. He recognized that the traditional alliance with Britain was useless for this purpose. Britain had no interest in fighting Prussia, especially not to restore Austrian territory. What Austria needed was a new ally, one powerful enough to help crush Frederick. That ally was France. The idea of Austria and France as partners was almost unthinkable. The two powers had been enemies for 2.5 centuries. The rivalry between Habsburg and Bourbon was the defining conflict of European politics. But Kaunitz was a visionary, and he saw that the old rivalries were becoming obsolete. The real threat to Austria wasn't France, it was Prussia. And France, increasingly, was beginning to see Prussia as a potential threat too. Meanwhile, Britain was making its own moves. Concerned about protecting Hanover, the German territory personally ruled by the British King, London signed a convention with Prussia in January 1756. Frederick, ever the opportunist, agreed to help defend Hanover in exchange for British support. But this British-Prussian agreement backfired spectacularly. It was exactly the leverage Kaunitz needed. He could now present the French court with evidence that Prussia was making deals with France's enemies. The betrayal, real or perceived, pushed France into Austria's arms. In May 1756, France and Austria signed their alliance. The diplomatic revolution was complete. The two great Catholic powers of Europe were now partners. Russia, already hostile to Frederick, joined the coalition. Sweden and most of the German states would follow. Frederick the Great suddenly found himself surrounded by enemies. France to the west, Austria to the south, Russia to the east, Sweden to the north. His only major ally was distant Britain, which could offer money and naval support, but couldn't put significant armies on the continent. The coalition against Frederick commanded resources that dwarfed anything Prussia could muster. France alone had 3 times Prussia's population. Russia had 5 times. Austria had twice. Together, they could field armies that outnumbered Prussia's forces by 10 to 1 or more. Frederick saw what was coming. A coordinated attack from multiple directions would crush Prussia before it could respond. His only hope was to strike first, to defeat his enemies one at a time before they could combine their overwhelming strength. On August 29, 1756, without a declaration of war, Prussian forces invaded Saxony. The 7 Years' War had begun, but to call this simply the 7 Years' War is to miss its true scope. What erupted in 1756 was not one war, but several interlocking conflicts that together spanned the globe. In Europe, it was a struggle for continental supremacy, with Frederick fighting for Prussia's survival against a coalition that sought to dismember his kingdom. In North America, it was the climax of decades of Anglo-French rivalry for control of the continent. In India, it was a battle for commercial dominance and territorial control that would ultimately give Britain an empire. In the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Philippines, it was a worldwide naval and colonial struggle. These theaters were connected. What happened in one affected the others. British resources that went to Germany couldn't go to America. French defeats in India weakened France's position in peace negotiations. The war was genuinely global in a way that no previous conflict had been. Winston Churchill understood this. Writing in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, he recognized that the 7 Years' War was qualitatively different from earlier conflicts. It wasn't just a European war with some colonial sideshows. It was a world war fought simultaneously on multiple continents, with the fate of empires hanging in the balance. The question was, who would prevail? The opening European campaigns established patterns that would define the entire war. Frederick's invasion of Saxony was characteristically rapid. Within weeks, the Saxon army was trapped and forced to surrender. An entire country had been conquered in a matter of months. Frederick forced the captured Saxon soldiers to join his own army, an early sign of the desperate measures he would need to sustain his forces through the long war ahead. But conquering Saxony didn't solve Frederick's fundamental problem. It merely made his enemies more determined. France, Austria, Russia, and Sweden all declared war. The coalition that Kaunitz had built was now fully mobilized. Frederick's strategy was simple in concept, almost impossible in execution. He had to defeat his enemies sequentially, striking at one before the others could intervene. He had to use Prussia's central position and superior mobility to compensate for his numerical disadvantage. He had to win decisive battles quickly because any prolonged war of attrition would exhaust his limited resources. In the spring of 1757, Frederick invaded Bohemia, hoping to knock Austria out of the war with a lightning campaign. He besieged Prague, trapping a large Austrian army inside the city. Victory seemed within reach. Then came the Battle of Kolin on June 18, 1757. Austrian forces under Marshal Leopold von Daun marched to relieve Prague. Frederick, despite being outnumbered, attacked with his characteristic aggression. It was a catastrophic mistake. Prussian infantry marched into murderous Austrian fire and was cut to pieces. Nearly 14,000 Prussian soldiers fell. The siege of Prague had to be abandoned. The invasion of Bohemia collapsed. Kolin was Frederick's first major defeat. It proved that he could be beaten. And it triggered a chain of disasters that nearly destroyed him. The months following Kolin saw Frederick's position deteriorate toward total collapse. Russian forces invaded East Prussia, defeating a Prussian army at Gross-Jiggersdorf. Swedish troops moved into Pomerania. A French army marched through western Germany, threatening Prussian territories from the west. Austrian forces pushed into Silesia from the south. By October 1757, Frederick was surrounded. His enemies were advancing from every direction. His army was shrinking, his treasury was draining. It appeared that Prussia was finished. Frederick himself was often despondent during this period. He carried poison with him, intending to use it rather than be captured. He wrote letters suggesting he expected to die. The confidence that had characterized his earlier campaigns was shaken. And then, in November 1757, Frederick pulled off one of the most remarkable military reversals in history. The Battle of Rossbach on November 5th was a masterpiece of tactical deception. A combined Franco-Imperial army of over 40,000 men was maneuvering to trap Frederick's force of barely 22,000. The Allied commanders were confident, pushing forward aggressively to cut off what they assumed was a Prussian retreat. They were walking into a trap. Hidden behind a ridge, Prussian cavalry waited for the perfect moment. When the Allied army had strung itself out in a long marching column, Frederick struck. Prussian horsemen swept around the Allied flank, crashing into the exposed column before the enemy could form battle lines. Prussian infantry followed with disciplined volleys. The Franco-Imperial army didn't just lose, it disintegrated. 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Prussian losses were fewer than 600. The entire battle lasted about 90 minutes. Less than a month later, Frederick marched his exhausted army across Germany to face the Austrians in Silesia. At the Battle of Leuthen on December 5, 1757, he achieved an even more stunning victory. Using terrain and his famous oblique order tactics, Frederick concentrated overwhelming force against a portion of the Austrian line while the rest of the enemy army couldn't intervene. The Austrians lost over 22,000 men. Frederick lost just over 6,000. Silesia was saved. Rossbach and Leuthen are considered among the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. They demonstrated Frederick's genius for battlefield command. They proved that Prussia could defeat armies twice its size through superior discipline and audacious tactics. But they didn't end the war. They merely ensured that Prussia would survive to fight another year. While Frederick was fighting for his life in Germany, another war was unfolding across the Atlantic. The conflict in North America had been building for years. French and British colonists both claimed the vast interior of the continent, the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, the lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Both built forts, made alliances with Native American tribes, and clashed in frontier skirmishes. The violence that George Washington had triggered in 1754 was just the beginning. By 1756, the colonial conflict had merged with the European War into a single global struggle. The early years were disastrous for Britain. General Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne ended in massacre. French forces captured British positions across the frontier. Native American allies of France raided British settlements, killing hundreds of colonists. Britain seemed to be losing the continent. Part of the problem was strategic incoherence. British efforts were scattered, uncoordinated, led by mediocre commanders pursuing conflicting objectives. The colonial assemblies bickered with each other and with London. Nobody seemed to have a clear vision for winning the war. That changed when William Pitt took control of British war policy. Pitt was not a likable man. He was arrogant, theatrical, prone to dramatic mood swings and theatrical rhetoric. He had few friends and many enemies in the political establishment. But he had something that his predecessors lacked, a strategic vision. Pitt understood that the war would be won or lost in the colonies, not in Europe. The continent mattered, but only as a sideshow. The real prizes were Canada, India, the Caribbean, the colonial territories that would determine commercial and naval supremacy for generations. Every resource Britain could spare should be devoted to crushing France in the colonial sphere. This was a radical reordering of British priorities. Traditional British strategy emphasized the European balance of power, with colonial ventures as secondary concerns. Pitt reversed this entirely. Europe was the sideshow. The colonies were everything. Under Pitt's leadership, British strategy in North America became coherent and aggressive. Major expeditions were launched against French strongholds. Competent commanders replaced the mediocrities who had been fumbling the war. Resources poured across the Atlantic. The results would transform the continent. The year 1758 marked the turning point in North America. British forces under General Geoffrey Amherst captured the fortress of Louisbourg, the French stronghold that guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. It was a major victory that opened the path to Quebec itself. Elsewhere, British forces captured Fort Frontenac, disrupting French supply lines to the interior. The Iroquois Confederacy, which had been maintaining careful neutrality, began to lean toward Britain. The momentum was shifting, and in 1759, everything came together. General James Wolfe led a British force up the St. Lawrence to besiege Quebec, the capital of New France and the key to French control of Canada. The siege dragged on through the summer, with French forces under the Marquis de Montcalm defending from seemingly impregnable positions on cliffs above the river. Wolfe grew desperate. His forces were sick, exhausted, running out of time before winter would force them to withdraw. He needed to bring Montcalm to battle, but the French refused to leave their fortifications. Then Wolfe found a path. In the early hours of September 13, 1759, British soldiers scaled the cliffs west of Quebec, pulling themselves up a narrow path that the French had assumed was impassable. By dawn, Wolfe had assembled his army on the Plains of Abraham, a plateau just outside the city walls. Montcalm had no choice but to fight. He marched his forces out of Quebec to confront the British in open battle. What followed was brief and decisive. The French advanced, but British infantry held their fire until the enemy was close, then unleashed devastating volleys that shattered the French lines. Both commanders died in the battle. Wolfe was shot 3 times and died knowing that his gamble had succeeded. Montcalm was mortally wounded and died the next morning. But the outcome was clear. Quebec had fallen. Canada was lost. The following year, British forces captured Montreal. All of New France surrendered. The dream of a French empire in North America was finished. The war in the Americas was effectively over. Britain had won. But North America was only one theater of this global war. 6,000 miles away, another struggle was unfolding that would prove equally consequential, perhaps even more so in the long run. India in the mid-18th century was a land of crumbling empires and rising opportunities. The Mughal Empire, which had once ruled the entire subcontinent, was disintegrating. Regional powers competed for the fragments. And hovering around the edges, growing stronger each decade, were the European trading companies, particularly the British East India Company and its French rival, the Compagnie des Indes. These weren't governments in the traditional sense. They were commercial enterprises, chartered by their home countries, but operating with remarkable autonomy. They had their own armies, their own diplomats, their own territorial ambitions. And in India, they had become major players in the complex game of subcontinental politics. The British and French companies had been competing for decades, forming alliances with various Indian rulers, fighting proxy wars, maneuvering for commercial advantage. When the 7 Years' War began in Europe, it transformed this commercial rivalry into open military conflict. The man who would define British victory in India was an unlikely hero. Robert Clive had come to India as a teenage clerk for the East India Company. He was depressive, possibly suicidal, certainly difficult. He had tried to shoot himself twice, and the pistol misfired both times, leading Clive to conclude that fate must have preserved him for some greater purpose. That purpose turned out to be empire. Clive had demonstrated military aptitude during earlier conflicts, showing a gift for bold action and personal courage that impressed his superiors. By 1756, he was one of the most important British figures in India, just in time for the crisis that would define his career. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was young, impetuous, and increasingly alarmed by the growing power of the European trading companies in his territory. In June 1756, he attacked the British settlement at Calcutta, capturing the city and its garrison. What followed became one of the most infamous incidents in British imperial history, the Black Hole of Calcutta. According to British accounts, Siraj's forces crammed over 100 British prisoners into a tiny guardroom measuring roughly 14 by 18 feet. In the sweltering heat of a Bengal summer night, the prisoners suffocated. By morning, only about 24 were still alive. The actual number of deaths remains disputed. The original account, written by a survivor, may have exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But the incident became a powerful symbol in Britain, a rallying cry for vengeance against Indian barbarism. Robert Clive was tasked with retaking Calcutta. He arrived with a small force in early 1757 and quickly recaptured the city. But Clive wanted more than just restoration of the status quo. He wanted to break Siraj's power entirely. What followed was a masterpiece of intrigue. Clive made contact with Siraj's own generals, who were discontented with their young Nawab. He promised them power and position if they would betray their master. A conspiracy was formed. The battle that followed would be more political theater than military engagement. The Battle of Plassey on June 23, 1757, was perhaps the most consequential skirmish in British imperial history. Clive had roughly 3,000 men, mostly Indian sepoys with a corps of British soldiers. Siraj's army numbered perhaps 50,000. By any conventional calculation, the British should have been annihilated, but most of Siraj's army never fought. The conspirators led by Mir Jafar, one of Siraj's top commanders, held their forces back, watching as Clive's small force engaged the Nawab's loyal troops. After a brief exchange of fire and a confused cavalry engagement, Siraj's army began to melt away. The Nawab fled. Within days, he was captured and killed. Mir Jafar became the new Nawab of Bengal, but as a puppet of the British East India Company. In exchange for Clive's support, he paid enormous sums to the company and granted extensive trading privileges. The company became the real power behind the throne. Plassey was not a military victory in any traditional sense. Clive's forces suffered fewer than 100 casualties. But it was a political and commercial triumph of staggering proportions. Bengal was one of the richest provinces in the world. Its textiles, its agriculture, its strategic position at the heart of Indian trade. And now it was effectively under British control. The wealth that flowed from Bengal would help finance Britain's global wars for generations. The precedent established at Plassey of the company acting as kingmaker and power behind Indian thrones would eventually lead to direct British rule over the entire subcontinent. Clive returned to Britain a hero, fantastically wealthy, celebrated as the conqueror of Bengal. He had added an empire to British possessions almost single-handedly. The French position in India, meanwhile, was collapsing. French forces at Pondicherry and other settlements were overwhelmed by British attacks. By 1761, French power in India was effectively broken. Britain would dominate the subcontinent for the next centuries. The Caribbean saw similar patterns of British naval supremacy. The Sugar Islands of the West Indies were among the most valuable territories on Earth. Sugar was the oil of the 18th century, an addictive commodity that generated enormous wealth for whoever controlled its production. British and French planters had made fortunes in Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and dozens of other islands. When war came, the Caribbean became a theater of naval warfare, amphibious assaults, and siege operations. British forces, backed by the Royal Navy's growing dominance, captured French island after French island. Guadeloupe fell in 1759, Martinique followed in 1762. The French Caribbean Empire was being dismantled piece by piece. Even the Spanish weren't safe. Spain had belatedly entered the war in 1762, joining France under the terms of the Family Compact between the two Bourbon powers. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Within months, British forces had captured Havana, the greatest Spanish port in the Americas, and Manila in the Philippines. Spain's global empire was suddenly vulnerable in ways it hadn't been for a century. Across the world, Britain was winning. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. British armies were capturing colonies. French and Spanish commerce was being strangled. William Pitt's vision of colonial supremacy was being realized beyond anyone's expectations. But in Europe, the situation remained desperate. Frederick the Great had survived 1757 through the miracles of Rossbach and Leuthen. But survival was not victory, and the coalition against him remained overwhelming. The years 1758, 1759, and 1760 were a brutal war of attrition. Frederick won battles, but at costs he couldn't sustain. His enemies lost battles, but had the resources to absorb defeats and keep coming. At Zorndorf in August 1758, Frederick fought the Russians in one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. It was less a tactical engagement than mutual slaughter, both sides attacking with savage fury, neither willing to retreat. Contemporary observers describe scenes of butchery, of soldiers fighting with bayonets and rifle butts long after their ammunition was exhausted. Both armies were wrecked. Frederick claimed victory because he held the field, but he had lost over 12,000 men he couldn't replace. Months later, Austrian forces surprised Frederick at Hochkirch, attacking his camp before dawn and nearly capturing the king himself. Frederick escaped, but another 9,000 Prussians fell, including some of his best generals. And 1759 brought Frederick to the very brink of destruction. The Battle of Kunersdorf on August 12, 1759, was the worst defeat of Frederick's career. A combined Austro-Russian army confronted the Prussians near the Oder River. Frederick attacked with characteristic aggression, initially driving back Russian positions. But the Allied forces held, and a crushing counterattack swept into the Prussian flanks. The Prussian army didn't break, it shattered. Nearly 19,000 Prussian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Frederick had to horses shot from under him and barely escaped the field. He wrote to his minister afterward, "I have no more resources, and to tell the truth, I believe all is lost." The road to Berlin lay open. The Russian and Austrian commanders could have marched on the Prussian capital and dictated whatever terms they wished. Frederick seriously contemplated suicide, but the blow never fell. The Russian and Austrian commanders couldn't agree on what to do next. The Russians were exhausted, far from their supply lines, unwilling to advance further without guarantees from their Austrian allies. The Austrians wanted to pursue, but couldn't do it alone. Weeks slipped away as the coalition argued. Frederick, given time he didn't deserve, rebuilt. Somehow, he scraped together reinforcements. Somehow, he reorganized his shattered forces. By the time his enemies coordinated their next move, he had an army again. The pattern would repeat. Frederick would suffer devastating defeats, stand on the edge of annihilation, and then survive through some combination of enemy mistakes, Allied disunity, and his own stubborn refusal to give up. By 1760, Prussia was being ground to dust. The famous Prussian efficiency was cracking. The army was increasingly filled with pressed men and prisoners of war forced into Prussian service. The currency was debased, with coins containing less and less precious metal. The population was starving. Entire regions were devastated by the constant passage of armies. Frederick kept fighting, but with diminishing resources and mounting desperation. He won victories at Liegnitz and Torgau in 1760, but each victory came at a cost he couldn't sustain. He was bleeding out, just slowly enough to remain alive. And then, in October 1760, the unthinkable happened. Russian forces briefly occupied Berlin itself. The Prussian capital was sacked by enemy troops. It was a humiliation that would have destroyed most rulers. Frederick survived that too. The Russians withdrew after extracting tribute. The war continued. Maria Theresa, watching from Vienna, remained convinced that one more campaign season would be enough. Frederick was clearly exhausted. His army was a shadow. His treasury was empty. One more push would break him. But the war was exhausting everyone. France was financially ruined, its military reputation destroyed by defeats in Europe and the colonies. Austria had spent blood and treasure for 7 years without recovering Silesia. Russia was straining under the costs of projecting power so far from its heartland. Everyone wanted peace, but no one wanted to be the first to admit defeat. The years 1761 and 1762 saw the war approach its crisis. Frederick was down to his last reserves. His army numbered perhaps 60,000 men, barely enough to defend against any one of his enemies, let alone all of them. British subsidies kept him afloat, but money couldn't replace the veteran soldiers who had died at Zorndorf and Kunersdorf and a dozen other battles. William Pitt, Frederick's champion in London, had fallen from power. The new British government, led by Lord Bute, was tired of continental entanglements. They wanted peace, even if it meant abandoning Prussia. The subsidies that had kept Frederick fighting were about to end. Frederick himself was increasingly fatalistic. He had been at war for 7 years. He had won victories that would be studied for centuries. And none of it seemed to matter. His enemies kept coming. His resources kept dwindling. The mathematics of the situation were inexorable. In December 1761, Frederick wrote, "I am at the end of my resources." The continuance of this war means ruin for Prussia, and then, on January 5, 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died. The death of Elizabeth was, for Frederick, a miracle. The new Russian emperor was Peter III, a man who was, remarkably, a passionate admirer of Frederick the Great. Peter had grown up worshipping Prussian military methods. He kept portraits of Frederick in his rooms. He wore Prussian-style uniforms. He had been devastated by the war against his hero. Within weeks of taking the throne, Peter pulled Russia out of the war. He didn't just make peace, he offered Frederick an alliance. The Russian troops who had been fighting alongside Austria suddenly switched sides. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. Frederick, who had been counting the days until his destruction, was suddenly reprieved. Historians call this the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, a reference to Frederick's royal dynasty. It seemed like divine intervention, fate stepping in to save Prussia at the last possible moment. In reality, it was pure chance, the random timing of an empress's death, the random personality of her successor. Maria Theresa was stunned. Her coalition had been torn apart by factors entirely beyond her control. All her careful diplomacy, all Kaunitz's brilliant maneuvering, all the blood spent over 7 years and done because one woman died and her successor happened to admire the enemy. Peter III would be overthrown and murdered just months later, replaced by his wife, Catherine. But Catherine, though she withdrew from the Prussian alliance, had no interest in resuming the war. Russia was done. Without Russia, the coalition couldn't win. France was already seeking peace. Sweden had withdrawn. Austria stood alone. Maria Theresa had to face reality. She could continue the war alone and risk losing everything, or she could make peace and preserve what she had. She chose peace. The Treaty of Hubertusburg, signed on February 15, 1763, ended the war in Europe. Its terms were simple. Everything went back to the way it had been before the war started. Frederick kept Silesia. After 7 years of warfare, after hundreds of thousands of deaths, after the expenditure of treasure that would take generations to recover, the borders were exactly where they had been in 1756. For Maria Theresa, it was the bitterest possible outcome. She had built the greatest coalition in European history. She had fought for 7 years. She had come within striking distance of total victory. And she had nothing to show for it. But the Treaty of Hubertusburg was only half the peace. 5 days earlier, a different treaty had been signed in Paris, and its terms were anything but a return to the status quo. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 redrew the map of the world. France ceded Canada to Britain, the entire vast territory of New France, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The dream of a French empire in North America was finished. France retained only a few small islands off the coast of Newfoundland for fishing rights. France also ceded all its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain, while the territory west of the Mississippi, Louisiana, went to Spain as compensation for Spanish losses elsewhere. French North America simply ceased to exist. In the Caribbean, France recovered Martinique and Guadeloupe. The Sugar Islands were too valuable for Britain to keep, but ceded other territories. In Africa, France ceded Senegal. In India, France was reduced to a handful of trading posts with no political or military significance. Spain, which had foolishly entered the war in its final year, paid heavily. Spain ceded Florida to Britain. In exchange, Spain received Louisiana from France, a poor trade that reflected how badly the war had gone for the Bourbon powers. Britain emerged from the Treaty of Paris as the supreme colonial power on Earth. It controlled Canada, the American seaboard, the Caribbean's richest islands, strategic positions across Africa and Asia, and dominant trading rights virtually everywhere. The Royal Navy ruled the oceans unchallenged. It was, by any measure, a total British victory in the colonial sphere. But victory creates its own problems. The war had been extraordinarily expensive. Britain had accumulated enormous debts financing military operations across the globe. Someone would have to pay for all this. And increasingly, British politicians looked at the American colonies, which had been defended at such great cost, and wondered why the colonists weren't contributing more. The attempts to tax the American colonies to help pay for the war would lead, within a decade, to resistance, then rebellion, then revolution. The very victory that had made Britain supreme in North America would plant the seeds of its loss. France, humiliated and financially ruined, began its own slide toward catastrophe. The debts accumulated during the 7 Years' War were never fully resolved. They would contribute to the fiscal crisis that eventually triggered the French Revolution, and Prussia, having survived against all odds, emerged as a great power, the first step on a path that would eventually lead to German unification and the transformed Europe of the 19th and 20th centuries. The 7 Years' War didn't just end in 1763. It set in motion chains of causation that would shape the next 2 centuries of world history. So, why did Winston Churchill call this the First World War? Why does this 18th century conflict deserve that title over the global struggles that came before or after? The answer lies in understanding what made the 7 Years' War genuinely different from earlier conflicts. Previous wars had certainly involved multiple European powers. Previous wars had spilled over into colonial territories. The War of Spanish Succession, fought 50 years earlier, had seen fighting in Europe, North America, and the Caribbean. But those colonial campaigns were sideshows peripheral to the main European struggle, dependent on its outcome, rarely decisive in their own right. The 7 Years' War was different. The colonial theaters weren't sideshows, they were the main event, at least for Britain. William Pitt had explicitly reoriented British strategy around colonial supremacy. The conquest of Canada, the triumph in India, the capture of Caribbean islands, these weren't incidental to the war. They were its purpose. And the scale was unprecedented. Fighting occurred simultaneously on 5 continents. European soldiers died in the snows of Silesia and the jungles of Bengal, in the forests of Pennsylvania and the plantations of Martinique. Native American warriors, Indian sepoys, African auxiliary peoples from every inhabited continent were drawn into the conflict. The war also demonstrated something new about the interconnected nature of global power. What happened in one theater affected all the others. French resources committed to Germany couldn't defend Canada. British naval supremacy in the Atlantic enabled victories in India. Russian pressure on Prussia freed Austrian forces for other operations. The world was becoming a single strategic space. This was, in short, the first conflict that was genuinely global in scope and conception. Not a European war with colonial footnotes, but a world war in which the fate of continents was decided. Churchill, writing from the perspective of the 20th century, recognized what he was looking at. He had lived through 2 world wars himself. He understood what global conflict looked like. And when he looked back at the 7 Years' War, he saw the prototype. The human cost of this First World War is difficult to calculate precisely, but it was staggering by 18th century standards. In Europe, the fighting killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million soldiers. Prussia alone may have lost nearly 500,000 people in a kingdom of barely 4 million. That represented a catastrophic demographic blow. Entire regions were devastated, villages were burned, crops destroyed, populations displaced. The economic damage took decades to repair. In North America, the death toll was smaller in absolute terms but proportionally devastating to colonial populations. Thousands died in battles and raids. Native American communities were shattered by the conflict and its aftermath. The French-Canadian population saw its world completely transformed, suddenly subjects of a British crown. In India, the casualties are harder to track, but the political transformations were equally profound. Millions of Indians found themselves living under the effective control of a foreign trading company. The path toward colonial subjugation was set. In the Caribbean, the toll fell disproportionately on enslaved Africans, whose labor powered the sugar economy that made the islands worth fighting for. Their suffering rarely appears in accounts of the war, but they were among its most numerous victims. And at sea, thousands of sailors died in naval battles, storms, and the disease-ridden conditions of 18th-century ships. The Royal Navy's triumph came at enormous human cost. Add it all together, and the 7 years were killed well over 1 million people, perhaps significantly more. For a world with a fraction of today's population, it was a bloodletting of immense proportions. But the war's true significance lies not in its death toll, but in its consequences. The Treaty of Paris created a new world order. British supremacy was established across vast stretches of the globe. The framework for the British Empire that would eventually encompass a quarter of the Earth's land surface was laid in 1763, but that supremacy contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The American colonists had fought alongside British regulars in the war. They had seen themselves as partners in a shared imperial enterprise. They had shed blood to defeat the French and secure the continent. And now, with the French threat removed, they began to question why they needed British protection at all. The British government, for its part, looked at the enormous debts accumulated during the war and decided that the colonists should help pay them off. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, these were attempts to extract revenue from colonies that had benefited from British military protection. The colonists saw things differently. They had no representation in Parliament. They had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs during decades of salutary neglect, and they had imbibed ideas about liberty and self-government that made British taxation feel not just inconvenient, but unjust. The road from the Treaty of Paris to the Declaration of Independence was not straight, but it was continuous. The very victory that had made Britain supreme in North America made British control unnecessary. The war had removed the external threat that had bound the colonies to the mother country. Without France looming across the frontier, why did Americans need Britain at all? 13 years after the Treaty of Paris, another revolution began. And among its leaders was the same George Washington whose ambush in the Pennsylvania wilderness had triggered the global conflict in the first place. History, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. France's trajectory after 1763 was equally consequential and equally catastrophic. The war left France financially ruined and nationally humiliated. The French military had been repeatedly defeated in Europe, while the colonial empire had been stripped away. The monarchy's prestige, already damaged by decades of mismanagement under Louis XV, was severely wounded. The debts accumulated during the 7 Years' War were never fully resolved. Successive ministers tried and failed to reform French finances. The aristocracy blocked new taxes. The system staggered along, accumulating more debt, approaching the breaking point. When France intervened in the American Revolution, seeking revenge against Britain and supporting the colonists' struggle for independence, it achieved a strategic victory but accelerated its own collapse. The expense of the American war pushed French finances past the point of recovery. In 1789, 26 years after the Treaty of Paris, the French Revolution began. The monarchy that had fought the 7 Years' War was swept away. Louis XVI, grandson of Louis XV, went to the guillotine. A new age of revolutionary warfare began. The chain of causation is not simple, but it is real. The 7 Years' War weakened the French monarchy financially and politically. It created conditions that made reform both necessary and impossible. It contributed to the crisis that ultimately consumed the old regime. Prussia's survival had consequences that would take even longer to unfold. Frederick the Great emerged from the war as a legend, battered, exhausted, but unbroken. He had faced the combined might of most of Europe and survived. His tactical victories were studied in military academies for the next centuries. His image as the philosopher king, who could also destroy armies, became a model for later German nationalism, but Prussia itself was devastated. The population was depleted. The economy was shattered. Frederick spent his remaining years rebuilding, reforming, trying to restore what the war had cost. What Frederick had proven, however, was that Prussia could compete with the great powers. A small German state with limited resources could, through military efficiency and strategic brilliance, hold its own against France, Austria, and Russia. This lesson would not be forgotten. A century later, Prussia would unite the German states under its leadership. The army that Frederick had built, the ethos of discipline and efficiency that he had established, would become the foundation of a new German empire. Bismarck and Moltke, the architects of German unification, consciously invoked Frederick's legacy. And the Germany that emerged from that unification would, in the 20th century, launch to more world wars that would make the 7 Years' War look modest by comparison, but which owed something to the precedents Frederick had established. The line from Frederick's Silesia to Kaiser Wilhelm's Belgium is not straight, but it exists. The 7 Years' War established Prussia as a great power. That great power eventually became Germany. That Germany became the most destructive force in modern history. The global consequences were equally far-reaching. In India, the East India Company's victories during the 7 Years' War established patterns that would culminate in full British colonial rule. Plassey was just the beginning. Over the following decades, the company expanded its control, defeating rival powers, absorbing territory, transforming from a trading enterprise into a governing authority. By the 19th century, Britain would rule virtually the entire Indian subcontinent, a dominion of hundreds of millions of people, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The foundations were laid during the 7 Years' War. In North America, the removal of French power created space for westward expansion. The Native American peoples who had played the French against the British suddenly found themselves facing a single, increasingly aggressive colonial power. The devastation of indigenous communities accelerated dramatically after 1763. Pontiac's Rebellion, a Native American uprising that erupted immediately after the war, was a direct response to the new situation. Native leaders recognized that the end of French power meant the end of their ability to play European rivals against each other. They fought desperately to resist British expansion. They failed. The pattern of dispossession and destruction that would characterize the next century of American history was set in motion. The war also transformed the nature of international relations themselves. The diplomatic revolution of 1756, the alliance between France and Austria that had seemed so shocking at the time, established that traditional rivalries could be overturned when circumstances demanded. The old certainties of European diplomacy were revealed as contingent, flexible, subject to revision. This lesson would be applied repeatedly in the centuries that followed. Alliances would form and dissolve based on strategic calculation rather than traditional loyalty. The balance of power became not just a descriptive concept, but a prescriptive principle, something statesmen consciously worked to maintain. The Congress system that emerged after the Napoleonic Wars, the alliance structures of the 20th century, the very idea that great powers should work together to prevent any single state from achieving dominance, all of this has roots in the experience of the 7 Years' War. The war demonstrated both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of coalition politics. Frederick had been nearly destroyed because he had made too many enemies. The coalition had failed to destroy him because its members couldn't agree on strategy or share sacrifices equitably. Both lessons would be remembered. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the 7 Years' War was conceptual. Before the war, European politics had been focused primarily on the continent itself. Colonial ventures mattered, but they were subordinate to European concerns. The great questions of diplomacy revolved around German princes and Italian territories and the balance of power in the Low Countries. After the war, the world was different. The colonial sphere had proven to be not a sideshow, but the main arena of competition. The resources, the markets, the strategic positions that would determine future power these lay overseas in the Americas and Asia and Africa. The British understood this better than anyone. They had won the war by prioritizing colonial objectives. They had gained an empire while their continental adventures had achieved little. The lesson was clear. The future belonged to whoever controlled the global commons. This insight would shape British strategy for the next centuries. Maintain naval supremacy, protect trade routes, expand the colonial empire, let continental powers exhaust themselves in land wars while Britain accumulated the resources that really mattered. Other powers would eventually learn the same lesson. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, the competition for Asian territories, the global nature of 20th century conflicts, all of this reflected the new understanding that world power required world presence. The 7 Years' War didn't create this understanding, but it demonstrated it with unprecedented clarity. After 1763, no one could doubt that European politics had become world politics. Looking back from our own time, what can we learn from the 7 Years' War? Perhaps the first lesson is about the unpredictability of consequences. George Washington, firing on that French patrol in 1754, could not possibly have imagined what he was starting. The chain of events that led from that moment to the fall of Quebec, to the triumph in Bengal, to the American and French revolutions, none of it was foreseeable. Small actions can have enormous consequences. The second lesson is about the costs of great power competition. The 7 Years' War killed over 1 million people and devastated entire regions. It bankrupted governments and destroyed communities. And in the end, what was achieved? Frederick kept Silesia. The map of Europe was essentially unchanged. The colonial transfers, though significant, could have been negotiated without war. Most of the death and destruction was, in some sense, unnecessary. The outcomes could have been achieved through diplomacy if anyone had been wise enough to try, if trust had existed between the powers, if ambition and pride had not overwhelmed calculation. But that leads to the third lesson. Such wisdom rarely exists. States compete. Leaders have ambitions. Trust is scarce. Pride matters. The conditions that lead to great power conflict are always present, waiting for a trigger. The 7 Years' War happened because the European state system made it almost inevitable. Multiple powers with conflicting interests, limited mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully, leaders who saw war as a legitimate tool of policy given these conditions. Some spark would eventually ignite a conflagration. Winston Churchill, reflecting on history, saw in the 7 Years' War a preview of the global conflicts he knew all too well. He had served in the British military during colonial wars at the end of the 19th century. He had been a leader during both world wars of the 20th century. He had seen what modern industrial warfare could do: the trenches of the Somme, the bombed ruins of London, the horror of total war. When Churchill called the 7 Years' War the First World War, he was drawing a connection across his centuries. He recognized that the global conflicts of his own time were not without precedent. The pattern's alliance politics, colonial competition, the interplay of European and overseas theaters had been established long before. But Churchill was also making a subtle argument about Britain's role in the world. The 7 Years' War had established British global supremacy. The two world wars of the 20th century were, in part, about defending that supremacy against new challengers. Understanding the First World War meant understanding the origins of the world order that Churchill had spent his life defending. History, for Churchill, was never merely academic. It was a guide to action, a source of lessons, a way of understanding the present through the past. The 7 Years' War mattered because its consequences were still being felt in the English-speaking world that had emerged from British victory, in the global system that British power had created and maintained. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763, but in another sense, it never really ended. The world it created a world of European colonial empires, of global trade networks, of great power competition spanning continents persisted for 2 more centuries. The British Empire that was born from the war would endure until the mid-20th century. The patterns of international relations it established would shape conflicts from the Napoleonic Wars to the Cold War. Even today, we live with the consequences. The United States exists because Britain won the 7 Years' War and because that victory made American independence both possible and, eventually, likely. The borders of Canada were shaped by the Treaty of 1763. The history of India remains marked by the East India Company's conquests. The 7 Years' War was not just an event in the past. It was a hinge point, a moment when multiple possible futures converged and one was selected. The world that emerged from the smoke of Rossbach and Plassey and Quebec was not inevitable. It was made by decisions, by battles, by chance, by the actions of individuals who could not know what they were creating. George Washington, ambushing that French patrol, set something in motion that would lead to a global war, to colonial revolutions, to the world we inhabit now. He was 22 years old. He was trying to impress his superiors. He had no idea what he was doing. None of them did. Frederick, rolling the dice on his invasion of Silesia. Pitt, reorienting British strategy toward colonial empire. Clive, bribing Indian generals to betray their Nawab. They were making decisions in the moment, responding to immediate pressures, pursuing short-term goals. And yet, from those decisions, a new world emerged. That is, perhaps, the deepest lesson of the 7 Years' War and of history itself. We make the future without knowing what we're making. The consequences of our actions extend far beyond our intentions, far beyond our lives, into a future we cannot see. The First World War was fought by people who had no idea they were creating the modern world. They thought they were fighting for Silesia, for Canada, for trade routes and sugar islands, and the balance of power in Europe. They were fighting for the future. They just didn't know it yet.